So before we start, I wanted to ask whether there is someone in the room who works on wealth inequality or closely related topics, or whether most people here have relatively little experience. Anyone working on wealth? One, two. Kind of, but not so, because this is important in terms of how detailed I can go into different sections of my talk. So I worked on wealth inequality and social mobility, and you might be a bit surprised that wealth inequality and social mobility are relatively detached research area, meaning you have people who work on wealth, how it is distributed, where it comes from, what consequences wealth inequality has. And you have people working on social mobility. And if you think about social mobility, the transmission of advantages and disadvantages across generations, one big aspect, of course, are inheritances. So monetary transfers given from parents to children. But interestingly, social mobility and wealth, like research, do not explicitly at the moment link inheritances to mobility or wealth. And this is what I'm trying to do with my work in general, meaning that even though I'm talking about mainly about wealth today, my background is really also centering on trying to understand what it means for intergenerational mobility. So 5 key themes for my talk. So I will start by talking about why we should care about wealth inequality at all. Why does it matter? Only afterwards I'm... Sorry. No problem. Okay, we're back. No problem. Only afterwards I'm introducing some basic definitions that will help us to understand the third aspect, which is about measurement and patterns of wealth inequality. Here the main question is wealth inequality really increasing, and where not? So what can we say? What do we really know about these patterns? What do we don't know? Then we have a broad range of theoretically motivated or empirically derived explanations of wealth inequality, which I'm trying to distill into 2 key aspects: inheritances and differential savings. And then in the end, I want to talk about some policies that could be effective in addressing wealth inequality, because my impression is that there are a lot of arguments around the support of policies such as wealth taxation or inheritance taxation that are, by the way, they're debated today, not necessarily might reduce wealth inequality. So we need to consider other policies as well. So why does wealth inequality matter? From an individual point of view, wealth is important because it is a buffer for savings, or a buffer in the form of savings for a rainy day. So if people lose their job, in case they have very low unemployment benefits, can consume the wealth. If people need to repair their car, their fridge, whatever, they can consume the wealth. So in that sense, this buffer function is really the key role wealth plays for low wealth households, so the lower half of the wealth distribution. Wealth is also important because it enables people to do something, or rather to not do something. So in the upper middle of the wealth distribution, people start to own their houses, and their wealth enables them not to spend a bulk of their income, in many cases, on housing. So if people own housing, wealth also affects their consumption patterns, their consumption structure, via allowing them to consume different goods. It's also enabling wealth to think about to not accept the first best job offer because you have a buffer. It also enables people to take on unpaid internships or unpaid jobs that might help you later on to progress on the career ladder, and so on. Wealth also serves third as a private insurance. So the more wealth you have, to a larger extent, people can buy out of public insurance markets in the sense of getting additional insurances, thereby sort of leading to a detachment from the public sector because people have private insurance. If you're insured privately, why would you want to rely on the public sector? Well, if it's a complex wealth portfolio consisting also a lot of financial assets, here we are already in the upper part of the wealth distribution. Wealth, of course, is an important origin of incomes. So wealth generates income, think about financial assets, and these incomes are concentrated in the upper part of the wealth distribution, in the upper part of the income distribution, and thereby wealth as a self-reinforcing, I would say, effect or relation to wealth inequality. And then the transfer of economic advantages. Here, the key distinction is that there are direct transfers, such as inheritances or gifts given during lifetime, and also what I would call indirect transfers, where wealth and inherited wealth sort of serves as the basis for other advantages, the access to networks, certain knowledge, insider knowledge. For instance, when I was working with Marlene Engelhorn for the Good Counsel, she has frequently used expressions I've never heard about because I'm not part of this community of wealthy people. For instance, if you want to solve a problem, you go to the Teppichetage. And finally, well, there are many arguments around, but little evidence. Wealth allows people to exercise power. And this, I think, is the key problem, because if there is differential power due to wealth gaps, it undermines the basic principle of our democracies. So one person, one vote. We tend to rather live in a world with $1, one vote as principles. So wealth inequality is a problem because the more wealth you have, the more you can do with it. So at the bottom, we have mainly this buffer function. At the top, it allows people to exercise other functions like power. Wealth inequality is also a problem because what people who own wealth do with it. Even though this is a graph referring to the CO2 emissions according to positions in the income distribution, sorry for this thing in German, the bottom 50, the middle, so the next 40, top 10, top 1, top percentile, and 1,000. And as you can see, the more income people have, the more wealth they have, the more CO2 they emit. And this is like a huge disparity. So the use of wealth is problematic by how it impacts society via climate change. We also know, okay, not exactly the important part is hidden. These are effective income tax rates. And for three countries, the US, the Netherlands, and the United States, essentially at the moment, the three countries for which we can say something like this. And effective income tax rates are decreasing in incomes. So the higher the income, the lower the tax rates paid. And this is essentially totally at odds with what we would say to be an efficient and also equal tax system. So again, this speaks to this power function of wealth, because would a democracy really vote or decide on a tax system where those who earn less, those who own less, pay lower taxes? I can't click. I have to use the.
Okay. That is sharing the screen, isn't it?
Yes.
So.
Is it not the one I'm?
No, it's your laptop.
Ah. So I click on Frage stoppen.
Aber können wir jetzt hier klicken, passiert nichts mehr.
Ja. Geht's weiter, das willst aber du, ne? Doch müsste auch.
Okay, jetzt geht's.
Okay, so wealth inequality matters to people. Why are people holding wealth or not holding wealth? It matters to society, especially via countervailing interests, I would say, and and unequal consequences of wealth inequality, also as how they are felt by people if you think about climate change. So there is a huge literature on its own that does nothing else than trying to get the measure of wealth inequality, meaning the best, the most appropriate estimate of the share of wealth being held by the top 1%. And these measurements debates are, as you will see later, they're really important. They might be making the impression of being a boring thing, but depending on how you measure wealth, you will find either an increase in wealth inequality, no change, even a decrease in wealth inequality, even for the same country. So this is important. And there are two different approaches. The first one is the macro view. So how much wealth is there at the aggregate in society? Second one is the micro view. How is this aggregate distributed among households, among people, and so on? Starting with the macro view. It's different. Okay, now I got it. So in the macro perspective, the key distinction is between private wealth and public wealth. So private wealth, all the wealth owned by the household sector, including businesses. So this is an important thing. We always ascribe businesses to private households in this research area. So there is no business that is an independent identity on its own, not owned by someone. Every company in the end has a beneficial owner in the end, even in cases where it's complex structures. So we always include here businesses. And then there is public wealth. So all the wealth held by the government sector, schools, housing, and so on, net of liabilities. So in terms of wealth, the key concept always is net of liabilities. And one of the main trends since the late 70s, early 80s, has been a shift in the ownership of wealth. So a bigger share of wealth is in relation to national income is owned by the public sector. So the share of total wealth, which we can decompose into private and public, the share of total wealth owned by governments is decreasing, meaning the share of total wealth owned by private households has been decreasing. Why is this important? Because it implies shifts in who controls wealth, who is able to decide about what to do with this wealth. And it's been pretty high in China, 70s. It's been also positive in Central European countries, so Germany, Japan, Norway, but now tends to be even negative. So this speaks about government debts being higher than stock of wealth. The second important aspect from this macro view is that not only has the ownership structure between private and public shifted, wealth in relation to income also has been increasing in its importance. So to get an idea of how important wealth is for an economy, for a society, the key measure that has been developed, that became the standard, is the wealth to income ratio. So how much wealth is there in relation to national income produced, earned in a given year? And we tend to see here a U-shaped evolution over the 20th century. So for instance, during the World Wars, when a lot of wealth has been destroyed, the relationship between wealth and income has been decreasing. So you needed to sort of earn income for less year to produce a given amount of stock. But again, in the late 70s, this importance of wealth in relation to income started to increase again. Why is this the case? Lower growth, so lower income growth, but also higher growth of wealth. These are these wealth to income ratios for a selection of European countries. And for most of the countries, the relationship between the total stock of wealth, in this case, private wealth, to national income is between 500% and 700%. Meaning the total wealth stock, in case it's 500%, is worth the GDP of 5 years. So you needed to have the same 5 times of a year's GDP to arrive at the stock of wealth that is currently available to the economy. What does this mean? The key implication of this is that pre-existing wealth or existing wealth and its transfer to the next generation is becoming more and more important, because you need to work more years of GDP, earn more years of GDP to be able to reproduce this stock. So what is here is more important than what we add from year to year. In a micro view, from a household perspective, the concepts are very similar. So there are different asset types indexed by A. These asset types have a price, P, and then we subtract debt. Important things to note here is, first of all, it's net, and typically we distinguish between real assets and financial assets. So real assets is housing, unincorporated businesses, sometimes also valuable like pieces of art, and financial assets, stocks, funds, shares. And what we also include typically in this definition is private insurances. Only private insurances, because the idea is wealth is what you can sell on a market. Public insurances, even though they might be important for an individual, are not marketable. You cannot sell your public insurance. So we only include private insurances here, and then net of all debts. So how can we now get empirical measures of this wealth concept, of this theoretical concept? There are, I would say, first of all, 3 groups of methods. The first group is what I would call direct methods, which is methods applied to direct observations of wealth. Whether you observe wealth directly in wealth tax data, so when wealth is taxed, data is generated, and in survey data, so household surveys on wealth. There is one big European survey, the Household Finance and Consumption Survey. Germany has an additional survey. The SEP also from time to time collects data on wealth. But what is actually more common is to use indirect methods. Why is it more common? Because few countries tax wealth, and survey data has a lot of problems. And addressing these problems in a way comparable across countries is not very easy. So people mainly work with these type of indirect methods. The first one is the so-called estate multiplier approach. It's really interesting because the idea is when people die, they leave a stock of wealth, their estate. And then what you can do is to infer the wealth among the living from the stock of wealth left by those who died. I will talk about this in more detail later, but basically what is used is estate tax data, inheritance tax data, probate records, where you observe people at the end of their lives and then you rescale and reweight it to get an estimate of wealth among the living. A very similar intuition is behind what the capitalization method. So as I've told you, wealth generates income, capital incomes. These are taxed, and capital incomes then are observed in tax data. And then what you can do is observing these capital income streams, assuming a rate of return, generalize it to the underlying stock of wealth. So you use wealth-related concepts, estates, inheritances, or capital incomes to get to an estimate of wealth inequality. But because all these approaches have their problems, there are many more. So one of them that has been used heavily recently is to use survey data and to combine it with rich lists. So survey data doesn't capture the top very well. You use data that is centered on the top, such as listings of the richest billionaires from, like in Germany, it's the Manager magazine from the Forbes magazine, and combine it in whatever way with survey data. Also, there are many combinations. So sometimes you have a wealth tax, like if you think about a long history, sometimes there has been a wealth tax, but no estate tax, then an estate tax, but no wealth tax. So people combine these approaches, which also is, they're not easy to compare different episodes of history. And then the most detached from data approach is the so-called global methods. So where people try to estimate wealth inequality for the entire world within each country, but without having actually data on most of these countries. So in the European context, household surveys are the most important source. So most countries either don't have estate tax data, inheritance tax data, or they don't grant researchers access to use it. And the key problem from household surveys is the same as in a wealth survey, but in general of household surveys. So first of all, it's really much harder to contact a billionaire, a super rich individual. They might have multiple residences. So if you sample them from a survey, how do you reach them? And that's more problematic at the top of the distribution. Second, even if you manage to reach out to a millionaire, he just can say, no, sorry, not interested, because household surveys usually are voluntary. And then if you manage to convince the billionaire, the multi-millionaire, to participate, it's highly likely that the person is misreporting, most likely underreporting his wealth. Why? He might have, or she might have, a super complex portfolio of financial assets, and in fact doesn't have much idea of what the worth of these things is at a given moment in time. It could also be deliberative. So like, I don't want to inform this unknown person about how rich I am in the end. We don't know, but we know it's a problem. And the entire thing then is complicated by the shape of the wealth distribution. So at the very, very top of the wealth distribution, people are relatively far away. So you have a couple of people with 100 billion, then one with 300, to exacerbate, but in terms of the structure. So because so much of the entire wealth is held at the very top of the distribution, you would need a relatively substantial share of people from the top to say something about inequality within this top. And usually this very, very top is not represented at all, or maybe you have one or two observations that would belong to the top 0.1% or so. And the thing is, as I've said, there are these European household surveys, the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, collecting wealth data for the Eurozone countries, in essence. But in each of these countries, these problems are a problem to a different extent. So it's really hard to compare these surveys across countries, but these are estimates that you would usually find in public debates or media discussions. So wealth inequality is higher in Austria than in Greece, but in Slovenia it's also very low, but it's really a matter of understanding what's behind this estimate, because for instance in Spain you would have the top of the distribution being very well captured. In Austria you would basically miss the entire top percent. So it's really, really hard to compare data from household surveys across countries. So what can be done? What we did is to combine surveys with rich list data from different magazines, the the French magazine, the Manager magazine in Germany, the Trend list in Austria, and so on, with HFCS data. And the key innovation that we introduced was to have a method that is flexible in the sense of it addresses the specific country-specific problems of the survey data, and then we combine it with the rich list data. Because previously, research in this area has just used the survey data, added the rich list, and estimated some functional forms at cutoffs, like set equally across all countries. And this approach, as we see, leads to big biases. And we have a very flexible method where we randomly, not randomly, but rather data-driven, is the correct expression, decide how and where to add this rich list data. So this is what we call a Pareto distribution, where you have net wealth levels and the inverse of the distribution function. So what does the graph tell you? You have a lot of people with very low wealth, and the higher you go up in the distribution, the less people. So it's the inverse of CF. And the gray points here are what we observe in the household survey. And it stops roughly around 10 million. And then we have the rich list data, which are these yellowish points here, and they start at about 100 million. So there is a big gap between the sources. And we bridge this gap by estimating a power law distribution, the Pareto distribution, which is here the pink line that combines them. And the innovative aspect of our approach is that previously people have said, okay, this Pareto distribution, it starts here. But actually, as you see, these distributions are linear. So if you start the distribution here at 1 million, you would get another shape. And if you do this for the same countries, it means that you assume that the top is this linearity is starting at the same level. And then we combine, based on the estimates of the parameters of the distribution, the survey data with the rich list data, and we add in what is missing in between. And the typical result of this is, if you correct for this missing rich, wealth inequality, measured wealth inequality increases. So the black dots are what the raw survey data would tell you, and the pink dots are what this Pareto adjusted approach would tell you. And as you see, In some instances, this adjustment is relatively high, and in others, it's relatively small, like Finland or France. Why is this the case? Primarily because they have better survey data. So in Austria, in the Netherlands, Germany, the survey data really failed to capture the top to the adjustment way, way higher. Does it matter if a wealth share tends to be rather 40% than 20%? I would say so, because it means that there are 20%, a difference of 20% that is not owned by those at the bottom of the distribution. Those who rely on wealth as a buffer, for instance. Next idea, mortality multipliers. So for estimating long-run trends, we need these indirect methods. Why? Survey data is a relatively recent phenomenon. So most wealth survey data starts in the 2000s with the exemption of the United States. So what is the idea? As I've said, the idea is that you have in each year a sample of the population who dies. And this method really assumes that those who die are a sample. And if you draw a sample and you want to speak about the population, the living, what you need to do usually is to weight it by the inverse of the sampling probability. So to give you an example, in case that's not clear. So you have men aged between 60 and 20. That's the group we consider. And then in a specific year, you have a mortality rate of 5, meaning that 1 out of 5 men in this age group died in this year. So 1 out of 5, 20% mortality rate. So if 1 out of 5 died in a year, and you want to speak about the wealth of men aged 60 to 62 in this year, what do you need to do? You just need to multiply the wealth of these deceased men by their mortality rate, so 1 over 5. The problem is, do we really know mortality rates in detail? So what you usually can use is mortality tabulations by age, by gender, by the combination of age and gender. But of course, mortality is not unrelated to wealth, but we don't observe usually wealth-related mortality rates. So the assumption here is that within an age and gender group, people have the same mortality rates, thereby underestimating wealth inequality. What we are currently working on is to apply this approach to probate data. So Austria does not have a wealth tax and there is no inheritance tax. But when a person dies in Austria, that's a pretty intense legal procedure going along with the death of a relative. A person dies and then a court opens a file, the so-called probate file. And the purpose of these probate proceedings is to regulate the transfer of ownership rights. So if someone owns a house, it needs to be regulated and that's really an entry in a register, in an official register, to whom the house is passed on. If the deceased person owns a bank account, it needs to be made sure that the rights to the money or debt on this bank account are given to the right person. And these court files, these probate files, there is one for each deceased, are archived in district courts. And they exist since the 15th century, 1500 something. So going long back in time. And what we started to do is to sample these files and digitize them. So we have a lot of people spending their time in these court archives to digitize these probate files. And then we can use them to estimate these mortality-based wealth inequality series. One interesting finding that I found a bit surprising this is now only for the city of Vienna. Using this data, what we see is that most people die with essentially zero wealth, and a substantial share, around 20%, die with debt. And then at the top, as you go up, it states, so what is left, this is what is left, not what people receive, increase substantially. And of course, this has implications for this mortality approach. Previously, people have been using estate tax data, but if you have negative wealth, it's not taxed. And then a third approach to which I wanted to draw your attention, because it's really important to keep in mind if we use wealth data, where it comes from. Okay, these are shares of the top 1% total wealth held by respective group in, this is South Africa, then we have the entire world, we have Namibia, Qatar, Paraguay, Kyrgyzstan, Ghana, and the United States. So how can you estimate wealth inequality in Kyrgyzstan, or in Namibia, or in Qatar? So what people have been doing to understand how wealth is distributed globally, and then what is behind these estimates is you have a subset of countries where you know relatively well the level of income inequality and the level of wealth inequality. And the two are related, so you have a correlation. You also know a bit about what determines wealth inequality at the macro level. So essentially, using this correlation between wealth and income inequality in the subset of rich countries for which we observe both, it's nothing else than a regression. So implying for the entire world the correlation between income and wealth inequality as we observe it, and then adjusting for some macroeconomic factors. But most of these estimates of wealth inequality that don't refer to the US, to the UK, to France, to Germany, to South Africa, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, are primarily synthetic, especially if it's about long run trends. So this is why, this is the basis for statements like wealth inequality is decreasing in Paraguay and there is very little change in Qatar. But so what I wanted to urge is just be careful if you find wealth data or if you want to use wealth data for macro questions, what you really observe and which data can be used reliably and which probably rather not. So this is from the same database for European countries starting in 1995. So as I said, wealth surveys started around here. For most of these countries, the first one was run in 2008. Wealth inequality, as we see, is relatively stable. Where do these estimates pre the existence of wealth data come from? Again, regression-based extrapolation. And then it's no surprise, relatively no surprise, where there you would conclude, wealth inequality in Austria, Slovenia, Slovakia, it didn't really change since the 90s. So why is everyone speaking or talking about this increasing wealth inequality problem? One thing that we know for sure about the distribution of wealth across the world, wealth is much more unequally distributed than income. So we have typical Gini's for income of 0.3. For wealth, it tends to be twice as high. That's something we know for sure. What we don't know is whether wealth inequality in a given country has really been increasing or decreasing. So, I mean, we have a tendency to understand what has happened in some countries, but overall, it's not well understood. So these are different estimates of wealth concentration in the United States from different papers. So each color or each line is an estimate derived by different researchers. And then you have some where you don't have an increase, some where there has been an increase, and some, the more recent ones, where there has been not much change. And what's the difference across these lines? Again, being substantial, ranging from 20-25 up to 40 or even more. It's just different methodologies. Same for Spain, so not so clear. Same for the recent period in the Netherlands. And if you're interested in these aspects or in this data, what we have done is to build a huge database that collects and assembles all the wealth inequality estimates available in the world, everything, and characterizes and systematizes them so that you really know what you are comparing. The second thing, in addition to wealth inequality being much higher than income inequality, that we know for sure is that there is an increasing concentration of wealth among billionaires. So even though it's hard to be very clear about the top 1%, the top 10%, what we know is this very, very small group of the top 0.1%. So the billionaire population or multi-millionaire populations, they're really receiving much bigger shares of total wealth. So how can we explain wealth inequality? And when I speak about explaining wealth inequality, what I'm focusing on now is a static perspective. So wealth inequality in a given year, rather than in terms of trends over time. So there is a very simple wealth accumulation equation that I'm sure that you are directly or indirectly familiar with. So wealth is a function of wealth owned in the last year, the return on the wealth, so R times WT, how much it is growing, the income you receive, inheritances or gifts that are added to the stock, and savings. So in this perspective, any inequality in wealth is a function of the last term, differential savings rates. People with higher income can save more, or people with lower income must consume more. Inheritances and gifts received, and rate of returns. So an important debate at the moment here is the observation that the higher wealth, the higher the return on the wealth, which is a key driving mechanism of changes in wealth inequality and of differences in wealth across people in that sense also. My perspective is rather driven by another decomposition, which is wealth in a given year can be decomposed into wealth that has been there, so sometimes referred to as self-accumulated wealth, and inheritances. So what does this mean, self-accumulated wealth? It's again the difference between income and consumption. And then you have the inheritances and differential return where things grow from year to year. So a key question is, how do inheritances, monetary inheritances that directly contribute to wealth inequality? And so this is something that people really tend to misunderstand, because it's relatively clear, even though people sometimes don't want to hear this, that in a static view from year to year, inheritances decrease wealth inequality. Why is this the case? You have a millionaire and you have something in the bottom of the distribution. The person in the bottom of the distribution owns 1,000 euros and the millionaire has 2 million. The person at the bottom of the distribution inherits 1,000 and the millionaire inherits 1 million. In absolute terms, of course, the millionaire gets more. So absolute discrepancies increase. But in relative terms, the person at the bottom gets a bigger increase. So the wealth doubles. While for the millionaire, in this case, it was just a change by 50% of the wealth. And this tends to be empirically, in many countries, the case. So inheritances in this scenario are less unequally distributed than wealth. And relative wealth inequality, such as the Gini coefficient or top shares, are decreased by inheritances. But does this imply that inheritances are a good thing, that inheritances can really change the structure of the wealth distribution by acting as an equalizing force? No. Because if you then follow people over time, this equalizing effect is diluted. So what is the reason for this? People use their inheritances in different ways. So those at the bottom of the distribution might need it or use it to pay off the debt, to use an extreme case, and those at the top of the distribution use it to buy a house, which allows them to save more. They use it to invest in the financial markets, which generates additional returns, and so on. So in the medium or long run, inheritances, of course, increase wealth inequality. But it's important, I think, to understand this debate, because sometimes people bluntly say, oh, inheritances, why do you want to tax them? They decrease wealth inequality. No, it's just if you look at the pre and post inheritance year. If you look at life cycle inheritances, clearly, and this is an emerging consensus, if not already being a consensus, inheritances increase wealth inequality. Another key thing in terms of the inequality implications of inheritances, from my point of view, refer to pre-existing structural inequalities, such as gender inequality. So there is a very interesting stream of research that looks at how inheritances and inheritance tax schemes impact gender inequality. And the study I'm citing here is actually referring to Germany. And what is seen in this paper using German inheritance tax data is that, so first of all, women inherit less. Second, women inherit different types of assets than men. Men get business assets, women money or real estate. What's the thing? Business assets are exempt from taxation. So given the same level of the transfer, women pay more inheritance tax than men because they receive different asset types. And also sort of the combined impact of this, first of all, gendered nature of parental transfer. Parents tend to still want to give their business to their son and the money to the daughter, combined with the implicit gender bias of the tax system, lead inheritances and inheritance taxation to increase gender-based wealth inequality in Germany. So, going from here, in terms of the role of inheritance and inheritance taxation, what can be done? Are inheritance taxation taxes or wealth taxes capable of reducing wealth inequality? So, in addition to these direct equality effects of inheritances, there is the impact of inheritance taxation. And the problem is that all the inheritance tax schemes I know across the globe, they're really, really bad designed. So it's really we don't have an inheritance tax that would a country introduce an inheritance tax could work as a blueprint or a recommendable structure. Existing inheritance taxes tend to be regressive. Similar to the inheritances, the higher you up in the wealth distribution, the more tends to be received in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it's lower. And this applies also to the taxation. So the further up in the inheritance distribution, the higher the absolute amount tax that is paid, the lower the relative share of the inheritance paid as a tax. Why is this the case? Think about the exemption of business assets. If you are at the top of the inheritance distribution, then people tend to get complex portfolios or assets that are exempted from taxation, meaning similar to what I've showed you in the beginning for the income taxes, inheritance taxes paid increase in inheritances. So the more you get, the more loopholes the tax systems tend to offer. So inheritance taxation, in the way the tax systems exist at the moment, or in the way that inheritance taxes are suggested by institutions, political parties at the moment, wouldn't change much. This doesn't mean that there are no justifications for it, but I don't think that the impact on wealth inequality is sort of the best approach to argue in favor of these taxes, because there are so many problems, and you would really have to be very progressive, very encompassing, no exemptions tax system, combined with exit taxation to have substantial impact. And at the moment, basically no one is willing to work towards such encompassing tax schemes. So the other idea is based on the principle that too much is simply too much. So who needs 1 billion? What can you do with 1 billion? What can people do with 100 million? So increasingly, researchers are arguing for limits, be it in absolute terms, be it in relative terms, to excessive wealth, either via taxation or via caps. So this taxation system that essentially would be confiscatory, because it has very, very high tax rates at the top, and ultimately would limit wealth, was suggested by Thomas Piketty in the beginning. So he had designed a tax system where above the 1,000 or 100,000 fold of wealth, you would pay 99% in tax, and if you do this year by year, wealth gaps would decrease substantially. So this is the idea of what I've meant before, that you would really need to have a very, very progressive tax system to be able to reduce wealth inequality via taxation. The other closely related argument comes from Branko Milanovic, who argues that you need to tax inheritance and by contrast, allow people to participate more in financial markets. So his idea of deconcentration of capital is targeted to not so much taxing wealth, but bringing more people into participating in relevant markets, so financial markets, which is very, very different from the idea of Piketty, who has this strong focus on the tax system. And then there are at least three, or these are the three ideas in terms of the three ideas I'm aware of in terms of setting limits. So there is the Belgian philosopher and economist Ingrid Robeijens, who argues based on the negative or based on the non-democratic origins, let's say, of wealth concentration, to just limit wealth at an x-fold of or at an absolute level in her case. So I think she's been suggesting like 10 millions. 10 millions is enough. Who needs more than that? Another idea is by Martin Schürz, the excessive richness. He's the only one who doesn't argue for a hard cutoff on excessive wealth, but rather on the idea that people should decide on such limits in deliberative settings, rather than having a hard cap set. And the other one, it's a very Aristotelian idea by a German, I think, also philosopher, coming from justice theories, who argues that the ratio of median to maximum wealth should be like 1:4. Why Aristoteles? Because basically Aristoteles had the very same idea already. So almost in time to conclude. So wealth is becoming more important in terms of stocks, in terms of what is transferred from here to here. The patterns of where wealth inequality is increasing, whether it has been increasing, why it has been increasing in some cases and not in others, I would say are much less well understood than is sometimes even frequently said. And inheritances are a key driver of wealth inequality already today. And given that inheritance flows are projected to double in the next 2 or 3 decades, their importance is like increasing. And if the idea or the goal is to decrease wealth inequality, my argument would be that wealth taxation is like not the first best policy, because you need to have support, or you need to build support for super progressive wealth taxes to be able to have a substantial impact on wealth inequality. Thank you.